This is Ethan Port from TIBCO Software. In this movie, you will see how to run the ASPaint example that installs with TIBCO ActiveSpaces. You will also see how to use ASPaint and the ASMM GUI to demonstrate how data is distributed between space seeders and how data is shared between space members. We have installed TIBCO ActiveSpaces on this virtual machine image. Navigate to the ashome/examples/java folder. You see there is an ASPaint.jar file. This file also ships with the product even before you compile the Java examples. Compiling the Java examples is covered in an earlier movie. The ASPaint folder contains the source code for the example, and also a resources folder with some graphics used by the example. To run ASPaint, navigate back to the ashome/examples/java folder. Also make sure you have JDK version 1.6 or greater installed. Then just type java-jar aspaint.jar. By the way, also make sure you use a 64-bit version of the JDK if you have installed the 64-bit version of ActiveSpaces. Connect to the default MS metaspace with the discovery URL tcp://:50,000. This is the discovery URL we have been using in all of the movies so far. You see the ASPaint window open. Start the ASMM GUI utility. You can learn how to do this in another movie, but basically you just usually type ASMM.exe from a command window. You see in this demo, we also have some ASAgent seeder processes running. ASPaint created a new space called Paint. In ASMM, you see the ASPaint process is also a paint space seeder. The paint space has a key field named ID. Here you can see all the other fields in the paint space schema. Now select the pencil tool and draw some points. Each point is a separate tuple, so this option gives you a simple way to quickly populate a space with example data. Now start a second ASPaint process. Connect the second ASPaint process to the same default MS metaspace with the same discovery URL. You see the second ASPaint gets copies of all the space data. It does this by creating a space browser to get every tuple in the space. Both ASPaint processes now have synchronized, consistent views of the distributed paint space data. You can add entries from either ASPaint member processes. In fact, if another process were to delete or change tuples, these changes would be immediately visible to both ASPaint processes. You can add entries from either ASPaint member process. Now, in the first ASPaint process, switch the type to rectangles and add more tuples to the paint space. There are currently 4 purple rectangles in the paint space. In the ASPaint 1 canvas, select the Seeded Only checkbox. This shows you only tuples that are locally seeded by this ASPaint 1 process. You see only 2 of the 4 rectangles are seeded by this ASPaint 1 process. In the other ASPaint 2 process, when you select the same Seeded Only checkbox, you see only the tuples locally seeded in this ASPaint 2 process. And you see that this ASPaint 2 process only seeds 1 of the 4 rectangles. So the ASPaint processes only seed 3 of the 4 tuples. The 4th tuple is seeded by one of the ASAgent processes off-screen. In ASPaint 2, change the type to oval and change the color to green. Now draw some ovals in ASPaint 2. The first few ovals are seeded off-screen in the ASAgent processes. Now we draw an oval in ASPaint 2, but it is seeded in ASPaint 1. The next oval is seeded by ASPaint 2. Now let's explore what happens when we fail over some processes. Now kill one of the ASAgent seeder processes. Because the paint space is replicated, we see no data loss occurred, and the ASAgent seeded tuples are now seeded by the remaining paint space members. In the ASMM GUI, you see the data distribution. Now kill the second ASAgent process, and again you see no data loss occurs, and now the 2 ASPaint members seed all the tuples. To complete this demonstration, you will see how to browse the paint space and how to filter for only a subset of entries in the paint space. So now in ASMM, browse the paint space to look for the tuple data. This is using a snapshot timescope. You can also define SQL92 style filter strings to give you a subset of the available tuples. Here we write a filter criterion to filter for tuples that have the string rectangle in the type field. You can also create logical OR filters, so here we modify the filter criterion to filter for either rectangles or ovals, and you see more tuples returned. You can also create logical AND combinations of filters, so here we add a second filter string, x greater than 300. You can control-click both filters to only show tuples that match both of the filter criteria. In this movie, you saw how to run ASPaint processes and the behavior when you select the seated-only distribution mode and when seeders fail over. You can find more training material and other resources at ActiveSpaces.tibco.com, and you can communicate with other TIBCO users at tibcommunity.com, and you can find other training options at 10.tibco.com. Thanks for watching.